You know, when we picture the United States, we usually envision this land of just endless opportunity. We think of gleaming modern cities, towering skyscrapers, massive entertainment hubs, and, well, incredible wealth. But what if I told you that behind that polished postcard image is a much, much more complicated reality? Because in some of America's most famous and celebrated cities, things like shootings, robberies, carjackings, and violent crime remain very serious, day-to-day challenges for the people who actually live there. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to take a close look at some of America's most dangerous cities based on commonly reported violent crime and homicide statistics. But we aren't just going to list them all as like a simple top 10 list. We are going to fundamentally reframe how you look at urban crime data. All right, let's dive right into this.
To kick things off, we really have to ask a fundamental question. What actually makes a city dangerous? When you hear the phrase dangerous city, your mind probably jumps immediately to massive concrete jungles, right? Places like New York, Los Angeles, or Chicago. And that makes sense, they get enormous media attention just because of their sheer size. But as we're going to see today, massive populations absolutely do not automatically equate to being the most dangerous places to live.
Now, it is totally crucial that we make a big distinction here. There is a massive difference between total crimes and crime rate. The media, they love to focus on total crimes. I mean, a city with 8 million people will naturally have a higher total number of incidents simply because, well, there are more people. But the crime rate is what tells us the actual statistical risk per person. Larger total numbers in a massive city do not mean a higher crime rate for the average person walking down the street. Context is everything here, and keeping this mathematical reality in mind is going to completely change how you view the list we're about to explore. So our countdown actually begins in the Midwest, at number 10, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Now, Milwaukee is a brilliant city. It's famous for its rich brewing history. It's got this gorgeous location right along the shores of Lake Michigan. But despite all its charm and cultural heritage, the city has really struggled with violent crime recently. Things like gun violence, robbery, and homicide are heavily affecting specific communities there. But here's the crucial point. We can't just look at Milwaukee in a vacuum. Like pretty much every city on this list, Milwaukee's crime problem is incredibly complex and it's deeply tied to systemic challenges. We're talking poverty, inequality, a lack of access to opportunity, and the spread of illegal firearms. These are the deeply rooted factors driving urban violence. So Milwaukee kind of establishes our baseline for this explainer. Crime doesn't just happen out of nowhere, it's fueled by intense environmental and societal factors. Moving right along to number 9, we have Cleveland, Ohio. Cleveland is so well known for its passionate sports culture and its robust industrial history. But, over the past several decades, Cleveland has experienced some massive economic shocks and changes. And with those economic shifts, some parts of the city have just continued to face really steep challenges involving both violent and property crime. However, Cleveland is the absolute perfect example of why you shouldn't judge an entire city by its overarching statistics. It brilliantly illustrates our next core concept, which is that danger is hyper-localized. The biggest differences exist at the neighborhood level. Millions of people live, work, and visit the Cleveland region every single year without experiencing any serious crime whatsoever. Honestly, calling an entire city dangerous is just painting with way too broad a brush.
Okay, just one spot higher at number 8 is Kansas City, Missouri. Kansas City is universally famous for its mouthwatering barbecue, its rich jazz history, and some incredibly successful professional sports teams. But running parallel to that rich culture is a very persistent concern with violent crime. Homicide and gun violence, in particular, have demanded massive attention from city officials and community organizations. And they've tried all sorts of different strategies over the years to reduce this violence, which really just proves how complicated of a puzzle this is to solve.
Coming in at number 7 is Little Rock, Arkansas. Now, you might actually be scratching your head a bit here. Little Rock is definitely not one of America's largest cities, so how in the world does it stand out so prominently on a list like this? Well, it all comes back to the math of population size. And this brings us to a vital mathematical concept, per capita. You've probably heard the term. It's a rate calculated relative to population size, rather than just adding up the total number of occurrences. When you hear that Little Rock has a high crime rate, it absolutely does not mean it has the highest total number of crimes in the country. It just means that relative to its smaller population, the frequency of crime is statistically high. This mathematical reality is exactly why a smaller city can sometimes leapfrog a massive metropolis in crime data.
Moving down the list to number 6, we find Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis is internationally beloved.
It's famous for blues, soul music, and an incredible cultural history that literally shaped American music. Unfortunately, the city has simultaneously faced very serious problems involving violent crime. Certain years have brought devastatingly high levels of homicide, aggravated assault, and other violent offenses. But again, keep in mind, Memphis has vibrant communities, major tourist attractions, and totally diverse neighborhoods with wildly different safety profiles.
Breaking into the top 5, it's Detroit, Michigan. For decades, Detroit has been right at the very center of conversations about crime in America. Its history is completely tied to the rise and then the subsequent decline of the American automobile industry. As that industry faltered, Detroit suffered massive population loss, extreme economic hardship, and a real plague of abandoned properties. And all of that created an enormous vacuum and immense challenges for public safety.
But we really need to pause here because this is a huge takeaway. We cannot describe today's cities using stereotypes from decades ago. Detroit is a completely different landscape today than those gloomy media portrayals from the 80s and 90s. The city has undergone massive redevelopment. We're seeing huge downtown investments, new businesses, and revitalization projects that have totally changed parts of the city. Yes, crime is still a concern in certain areas, for sure, but relying on outdated stereotypes just blinds us to the real progress being made on the ground.
Number 4 brings us down south to Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham is another city facing a serious challenge with violent crime, particularly homicides. And much like Little Rock, we really have to consider its size. Because Birmingham has a smaller population than America's massive metropolitan areas, even minor shifts in the total number of crimes can just drastically alter its per capita ranking. It's a really stark reminder that these rankings can fluctuate wildly depending on the year, the specific data source, and the exact methodology being used.
Arriving at number 3, we have honestly one of America's most completely unique cities, New Orleans, Louisiana. Millions of tourists flock here every single year to experience the French Quarter, the absolute magic of Mardi Gras, the incredible jazz, world-class food, and a booming nightlife. It has a massive tourism industry. Yet, beyond the boundaries of that curated tourist experience, New Orleans has historically struggled with incredibly high levels of violence and homicide rates that fluctuate pretty significantly over time.
And this creates a really jarring contrast. For visitors, New Orleans is a prime example that vibrant tourist districts and struggling residential neighborhoods can exist in the exact same city while having completely different crime patterns. Actually, it can literally change street by street. The lived reality for a local resident in a struggling neighborhood is just entirely different from the weekend experience of a tourist in the French Quarter. Moving to number 2, we have Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore has long faced deeply entrenched challenges involving gun violence and homicide, and because of this, it has found itself squarely at the center of massive national discussions on policing, poverty, inequality, drugs, and the criminal justice system as a whole.
But listen, Baltimore is not just one single tragic story. We have to remember that crime statistics tell us what is happening, but they don't always tell us why. Those raw numbers on a chart completely miss the fact that Baltimore is brimming with historic neighborhoods, world-class universities, thriving businesses, and most importantly, deeply dedicated communities working actively every single day to reduce violence and reclaim their streets.
And now, the climax of the list. Coming in at number 1, frequently appearing at the very top of lists examining violent crime and homicide rates, is St. Louis, Missouri. But before you draw any conclusions, there's a massive statistical anomaly here that you absolutely must understand. The explanation lies in something called the boundary effect. You see, the official boundaries of St. Louis City are strictly separated from its much larger surrounding metropolitan area. So the population within the official city limits is smaller and highly concentrated, which artificially inflates that per capita crime rate we talked about. If St. Louis included its suburbs, like so many other sprawling American cities do, that larger population would dilute the crime rate, completely changing its ranking. This boundary issue means comparing St. Louis to broader cities is often just incredibly misleading. So, zooming out to the big picture, what actually is America's most dangerous city? Well, it depends entirely on how you measure it. Change the metric, and you completely change the list. If you rank by homicide rates, you get one list. If you rank by overall violent crime, the list shuffles. Add property crime to the mix, and it changes again. And if we measure danger by individual neighborhoods instead of arbitrary city limits, the map of American crime would look utterly unrecognizable from the top 10 list we just went through. But as we sit here and analyze all these numbers, rates, and boundaries, we must never ever lose sight of the humanity involved. Behind every crime statistic is a real person, a real family, and a real community. These are not just data points on a spreadsheet. America's cities are constantly evolving. Crime can rise or fall quickly. And in literally all of the cities we've discussed today, from Milwaukee all the way to St. Louis, there are real, dedicated people working tirelessly every single day to make their homes and neighborhoods safer.
And that brings us to the end of our analysis. Now, I want to turn it over to you. Which American cities surprised you the most on this list? Did learning about that St. Louis boundary effect change your perspective on these kinds of rankings? And hey, what should we cover in our next explainer? Should we dive into America's safest cities, the most dangerous states, or perhaps the cities seeing the biggest crime declines? Let me know your thoughts. If you enjoyed this explainer and found this structured breakdown helpful, make sure to engage and keep learning. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you in the next explainer.